Hi, this is Sabrina, and today I'm going to show you how to take sewing patterns that are designed to be cut on the straight grain and adapt them so you can cut the garment on the bias. As you probably already know, garments cut on the bias will stretch and drape more easily than garments cut on the straight grain. The resulting bias cut garments will glide sinuously over the body's curves and fall in graceful drapes. You can see the difference between cutting on the straight grain and on the bias by comparing these two dresses. I've cut and sewn these two slip dresses using the exact same pattern, but one is cut on the straight grain and one is cut on the bias. You can see the one cut on the bias hugs the curves of the body a bit more and drapes a bit more easily. So without further ado, let's get into how to cut garments on the bias. The first step is to mark the bias line on the pattern. Find the straight grain line marked on the pattern and then draw a line that is perpendicular to that. That's your cross grain. Next, mark a line that is 45 degrees between the straight grain and the cross grain. The easiest way to do that is to fold the paper so that the straight grain line meets the cross grain line. That is your bias line. Now that you've marked one bias line, mark the other diagonal so you have two different bias lines to work with. If your pattern says to cut the front or back as one whole piece, don't do that. Instead, split the piece into two halves and add a seam allowance to the center seam. Then cut each half separately with the straight grain going in a different direction. You can see here I've positioned the front and back bodice pieces on the fabric so that the straight grain goes in a different direction in both halves. The straight grain is marked in the photo with red arrows. Why do you need to do this? Because the straight grain and the cross grain do not hang in the same way. The cross grain is twisted less firmly than the straight grain, and it hangs longer than the straight grain, which skews the balance of the garment. That's why you need to split the front and back of the pattern into two halves and cut each half with the straight grain going in a different direction. That way, the resulting garment will be balanced. Next, use the marked bias lines to position the pattern on your fabric. Measure from your selvage to the marked bias line to ensure that the pattern is placed on the true bias of the fabric. Weigh down the pattern pieces with weights and cut out using a rotary cutter and cutting mat. If you don't have a rotary cutter, place a layer of tissue paper underneath the fabric to prevent it from shifting while cutting. And that's it. You've adapted your sewing pattern and cut your fabric on the bias. Now all you need to do is sew the pieces together. When sewing bias cut garments, you need to take a few steps to deal with the stretch in the bias cut fabric. Here are a few tips to keep in mind when sewing bias cut garments. Tip number 1, stay stitch the edges of your cut pieces. This will prevent the fabric from stretching when you sew, which will distort the seam and lead to rippling. To prevent this from happening, simply stay stitched slightly to the inside of your stitching line. Tip number 2, store your cut pieces flat and try to keep handling to a minimum. Carry the cut pieces of fabric to your sewing machine flat so they don't stretch along the way. While you're sewing, try to keep the fabric on the sewing table as much as possible, rather than dangling off the edge of the table or sewing machine. Tip number 3, don't pull the fabric while sewing. Let the feed dogs feed the fabric into the machine naturally. I like to use my walking foot, as I find this helps feed slippery fabrics into the machine much more smoothly. Tip number 4, use a zigzag or other stretch stitch. Bias cut fabric stretches, so you need a stitch that can stretch along with the fabric. Otherwise, the stitches may break when the garment is worn. I like to use the lightning stitch, which is a narrow zigzag stitch that looks very similar to the straight stitch. Tip number 5, hang before hemming. Again, bias cut fabric stretches out over time, so you'll want to hang up the garment for about 24 hours to allow the fabric to stretch out and settle before you hem it. Otherwise, you'll end up with a hem that's uneven because the fabric has stretched out to different lengths in different parts of the hem. And that's it. It's really easy to adapt basic sewing patterns to cut the fabric on the bias. Ready to give it a try yourself? Start with some simple patterns that have only a few seams and no darts, like the ones shown here. The links to these free patterns are in the description to this video.